now reached the third presentation in the series where we're looking at the insights from Ezekiel. I've entitled this Prophecy Enacted. Let's just look back for a moment at the previous presentations. We're looking at the writings of Ezekiel, who was trained as a priest and then called and equipped by God to be a prophet. He was born in the land of Judah. When he was about 30 years of age, his record started. By that time he was in exile. He'd been deported with others from Judah by the Babylonians to an area which in today's world is modern-day Iraq. And about that age he received a dramatic vision of God. And God commissioned Ezekiel, commissioned him to communicate, to convey what God wanted to say to the exiles, those who had been deported to the land of Babylon. We've got to remember what the word prophet actually means. The word is quite clear in its meaning in the Old and New Testaments. It's not a preacher, not a teacher, and not a celestial fortune teller predicting things in the far distant future in detail. That's not what prophecy is all about. The prophet does not choose what he or she is to say, nor does the prophet choose those to whom it is to be said. There is a description of what the word could mean. The prophet speaks the mind of God into a specific situation. To understand what they're saying, we've got to understand the situation. Hear what God is saying, and yes, there may be broad principles that can be drawn from it. There almost always are. But he's not a celestial fortune teller. In verse 5 of chapter 2 it says, they will know that a prophet has been among them. How would they know? Chapter 33 tells us how. Because Ezekiel was prophesying that God would not rescue Jerusalem or the land of Judah, and that it would be overrun and sacked. And when the news came through to the deportees that it had happened, the penny dropped, and they recognized Ezekiel had it right. He was indeed a prophet. Speaking the mind of God into a specific situation. The exiles there in Babylon were drawn from the leadership classes of Judah. And they did not understand what had gone wrong. Why had their city been captured? Why had a puppet king been put on the throne? Why had they been taken into exile? The tendency is when things happen and we don't understand them, we blame other people. And they still expected God to intervene to save their nation, their king, their temple. Even though for decades Jeremiah had made it clear that was not going to happen. So they expected the restoration of their nation state. In all of this, they were simply wrong. And Ezekiel had the near impossible task of telling them what was going to happen, what was inevitable, and why they were wrong. But they refused to listen. They'd refused to listen to Isaiah a century before. They refused to listen to Jeremiah, now an older man in Jerusalem. And they were going to refuse at the outset to listen to Ezekiel. At this point, God shows Ezekiel something totally unexpected. Yes, he's going to be a prophet, but he's going to have a restricted movement, effectively housebound. He was going to be restricted in what he spoke, where he spoke. So here we have a prophet who's housebound, unable to speak. Cuts right against our pictures of what a prophet is all about. And in fact, if we look at it in many years of his time as a prophet, he never went out to address the people. He didn't interact with people in the marketplace of life. He was isolated. And others drifted in and out of his world, built around his home. Too often we have the wrong picture of a prophet, someone standing up in a pulpit or on a platform. Ezekiel does not fit that pattern. But Ezekiel was truly a great prophet. Now let's move on into the next section. And in this section we'll find that, like throughout the whole book of Ezekiel, there are two ideas that keep repeating. The word signs and the idea of punishment, sometimes translated judgment. Perhaps punishment is better, but neither gives us a perfect picture. When it comes to signs, Ezekiel uses two words, largely interchangeably, uses them 8 times. And a sign is language made visible. Something happens, something is done that communicates. That's the sign. And when he could not speak, and he wasn't going out and standing on a platform, he was enacting, he was visualizing the message from God by acting it out before the people, the deportees near Babylon. Now the word punishment is a difficult word. In the English language it's got multiple meanings, as is the word judgment. Ezekiel uses one word and he uses it a lot. And it can be very confusing if we just assume that it means what we want it to mean in the English language. The word carries the idea of inevitable consequences for actions. It's not picturing God as a kind of heavenly policeman ready to drop upon us with a ton of bricks when we go wrong. That's not the way the word is used. It's more like, if you pursue this line, the inevitable outcome will be. Actions have consequences. They always do. It's a principle of life. And sometimes we suffer the consequences because our actions are wrong. Now we've got to be very careful in understanding God's role in this. In Hebrew thought, they saw God behind everything. Very often it was that God had withdrawn his hand of protection. So things happened that were not good. So bear these in mind as we go through this book and this chapter in particular, signs and punishment. But there's another idea that's very important, Son of Man. Now in the original it just says Ben Adam. Now the word Adam is the same word that you'll find in Genesis, only we've made it a name. It isn't a name. It's just an ordinary word. It means a human being. And God addresses Ezekiel, Son of Man, 93 times in the book. But the word Adam has a kind of emphasis to it. It means a human being with an emphasis on the distance between God and humans. Child of the earth. Human being. That's the picture. Ezekiel was an ordinary man. A young man, married, forcibly deported, in a foreign country, in a foreign culture, with people who'd been forcibly deported, struggling to eke out a living. An ordinary man. Now let's look at the chapter 4 through to chapter 5, verse 4. Now, Son of Man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it, erect siege works against it, build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it. Then take an iron pan, place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and turn your face towards it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the people of Israel. He was acting out what was going to happen to the city of Jerusalem. It goes on, then lie on your left side and put the sin of the people of Israel upon yourself. You're to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side. I have assigned you the same number of days as the years of their sin. So for 390 days you will bear the sin of the people of Israel. After you've finished this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the people of Judah. I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year. Turn your face towards the siege of Jerusalem, and with bared arm prophesy against her. I will tie you up with ropes so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have finished the days of your siege. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt. Put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You're to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day, and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of a hin of water, and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations, where I will drive them. Let's move forward. Then I said, not so, Lord, sovereign Lord. Remember, he's a priest. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No impure meat has ever entered my mouth. Very well, he said, I will let you bake your bread over cow dung instead of human excrement. He then said to me, Son of man, I am about to cut off the food supply in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed bread in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair. For food and water will be scarce. They will be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away because of their sin. Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn 1/3 of the hair inside the city. Take 1/3 and strike it with the sword all around the city, and scatter 1/3 to the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. But take a few hairs and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. A fire will spread from there to all Israel. Maybe our reaction is when we hear that, this enacted prophecy, it just blows our mind. What's this all about? Let's just look at the sequence of events to get the overall picture. God instructs him to make a model of Jerusalem with models of siege equipment around it. That pictures what was going to happen to the city. Then he's to lie on his left side for 390 days, bearing the sins of Israel. Then he's to lie on the right side 40 days, bearing the sins of Judah. Now he prophesies against Jerusalem with arm bared. You see, the people who watched this happening, the leadership class, now deportees, they were expecting God to save the city. It's God's city. We're God's people. We're special, they thought. It was the opposite of what they expected. Then he's given instructions for cooking, eating and drinking. And that models the food supply problems in Jerusalem. And indeed, under the siege that did happen, this is precisely the problem they faced. Then he's instructed to cut off all his facial hair and divide it up. Now, he probably had quite a lot of hair because in those days you didn't go to hairdressers. Once the siege is over, 1/3 is to be burnt inside the city, the little model. 1/3 struck with a sword round the city. 1/3 thrown up and blown away in the wind. But a few hairs are kept, but some of them are even burned. Chapter 5, verse 5, the interpretation comes. Probably given to Ezekiel. Whether he passed it on or not, we cannot be sure. Now, in this section, the word for sin, and there are many words in the original language that can be translated sin, probably the best translation is a rebellion. The people of God had rebelled against God. God who had rescued them from Egypt, given them a land, provided for them, protected them, looked after them, given them kings. We could go on. They had rebelled. They thought they knew better than God. They thought they could learn their lives better than God. God had been pushed to the edge. Yes, they believed in God. They kept the temple ritual going. But they were rebelling against God because they were running things their way for their benefit, and the ruling classes were doing very nicely out of it. Now each day, he couldn't possibly have been lying there for 390 days because he's instructed to eat food. So each day he would come out of his house, lie on his side, and it would be reenacted each day. And the people round about would just look at this. And it went on for a long time, more than a year. What on earth is he saying? But he said nothing. He just did it. Difficult to understand what he says, what it means when it says bearing sin. But perhaps it goes back to his priestly role. The priest took the sins and offered the offerings for them. But it was a rebellion for 430 years, and his lying on his left and then his right side lasted for 430 days, symbolically. Now, the numbers are not easy to interpret. There are many possible interpretations. 430 is the total, but one way is to say that it's about 430 years from the opening of the temple, which happened under King Solomon, to its destruction, which happened a few years later. And the slide into rebellion started with Solomon, who imported foreign religions with his foreign wives and set up all kinds of worship centers. And some of these activities in these worship centers were particularly evil. Temple prostitution and child sacrifice were part of the religious systems of the people around. 40 years, you meet that all over the Bible. It always represents a generation. It's symbolic. Anyway, whatever the exact meaning of the numbers, he is lying on his left and his right for the number of days that represents the number of years of rebellion of the people of God. It's all symbolic. He's communicating by actions, not words. And then the fall of the city is enacted. Using his hair as the picture. 1/3 die within the city walls. And the use of fire speaks of razing the city to the ground, destruction. When it happened in 586 BC, that is precisely what happened. The city was burnt to the ground, smashed up, and many died. 1/3 died fleeing. People realized the problem, tried to escape from the city. They were caught and killed by the attacking army. The Babylonians were all around. Some did scatter, so another third, and these are not necessarily numerical numbers, it's just pictures. They're scattered. They're dispersed. And they kind of disappear and get absorbed into the cultures around. But a tiny minority goes on as a unit. That may very well refer to the exiles, the deportees, because there were more deported in 586. Then they lived in Babylon for many decades. And from that tiny minority lay the future. But not all of them would respond. So there's a warning. Now, chapter 5, from verse 5, unfolds the meaning. So let's look at that next. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations, with countries all around her, that's true. Yet in her wickedness she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She has rejected my laws and has not followed my decrees. God had brought this nation into being, rescued them from slavery in Egypt, set them up in the land, protected them, guided, provided for them. And what God wanted for them was a quality of life that made an impact, a positive impact, on the people groups round about. They were to show God to those around. They failed. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You have been more unruly than the nations around you, and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. You have not even conformed to the standards of the nations around you. What a terrible indictment. Therefore, actions have consequences. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. That's the inevitable consequences of their actions. Because of all your detestable idols, they worshipped other things. They worshipped themselves and their abilities. I will do to you what I have never done before and will never do again. Therefore in your midst parents will eat their children, and children will eat their parents. When you get a bad siege, cannibalism often happens. I will inflict punishment on you and will scatter all your survivors to the winds. That happened. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your vile images and detestable practices, including child sacrifice, I myself will shave you. Going back to the picture of the hair shaved off. I will not look on you with pity or spare you. A third of your people will die of the plague or perish by famine inside the city. A third of you will fall by the sword outside your walls, and a third I will scatter to the winds and pursue with drawn swords. Then my anger will cease and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. Now just watch that word, avenged. We'll come to it in a moment. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal. I will make you a ruin and a reproach among the nations around you. That happened in the sight of all who pass by. You'll be a reproach and a taunt, a warning and an object of horror in the nations around you when I inflict punishment on you in anger and in wrath and with a stinging rebuke. Actions have consequences. People round about noticed. When I shoot at you with my deadly and destructive arrows of famine, I will shoot to destroy you. I will bring more and more famine upon you and cut off your supply of food. I will send famine and wild beasts against you, and they will leave you childless. Plague and bloodshed will sweep through, and I'll bring the sword against you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Now, reading that lot raises some real problems, big questions. Critics of the Bible rip a passage like that out of context, usually using an old, out-of-dated version of the Bible, which makes it even more confusing. And they taunt the followers of Jesus today. What kind of God do you worship that will do that? How can a God of love, the God that Jesus portrayed to us, how can a God of love do this to people? Why is God so opposed to idolatry? It's almost as if he demands our worship. And critics say, oh, he's too insecure. Does God pursue people, his people, with drawn sword? How can God be angry? Is anger not wrong? And back to that word avenge. Does God avenge himself against humans? Just two words of warning when we look at a passage like this. First of all, words in the original language are brought into English, and the translators have done the very best they possibly can. And any modern translation gives us a good clue. But words don't have exact equivalencies from one language to the next. So let's be very cautious. But secondly, we're talking about a people group about 2.5 millennia ago. Cultures were different. Thought forms were different. Language structures were different. And often they pictured God doing things when what they're actually saying is, this is just what happened. Because they saw God as behind everything. Today, we would very often say, God has allowed it to happen, but it was our fault. We brought it on ourselves. And that basically is what the text is saying. But let's look at it in a bit more detail. The idea of idolatry. Now, idolatry just simply means placing anything other than God at the center of our lives. There are lots of good things in life, and they are good. But when we place anything, even good things, as more important than God, then we live our lives revolving around these things. And what God knows is this. When we do it, we miss out on the best He has for us. God made us. He knows what's best. He knows what is the best way for us. He doesn't want us to miss out on that. And idolatry then led to very evil practices, including vast temple prostitution and even child sacrifice. Vengeance. Now, the original word has a much more subtle meaning. So we've got to be cautious. Very difficult to translate. Here's my attempt to try and get at an underlying meaning. God is putting things aright, and He does it by allowing consequences from our actions just to take place. He protects us again and again and again, but He eventually says, if you persist in this, I'll let things take their own course. And we face the consequences from our actions. Now that captures a bit of the meaning. Let's look at the word love. The problem is, into modern language today, the word carries an enormous amount of emotional baggage. In the biblical use of the word, God's love means that God's agenda is the best for each of us, no matter who we are, what we have done, and what it may cost Him. And that word doesn't have emotional baggage. It's not a word of emotion, it's a word of action. The good parent seeks the best for their child. Translate that up into perfection. God seeks the best for us. But because God loves us, He can be angry when we rebel and lose out on all that He has for us. Again, go back to the parent. The parent can be very angry when anything or anyone is likely to damage their child, including the child doing stupid things which may hurt them. Anger is action, not emotion. When anger is emotional, it's wrong. But that's not the anger of God. So we need to look at the real meaning of words. I'm trying to summarize it here. Love. Summarizing that. God's agenda is the best for each of us. All the time. Anger. God is angry when anyone or anything damages His creation, including us. Not emotional, neither the two words. Hate, which you'll find in the Bible. It's just not wanting the best for the other. But sometimes it's used as an idiom, meaning not loving as much. And jealousy. It could be translated as zealousy from the original language. God is committed to us, and He's deeply upset when we do things to ourselves that will reduce our life quality. He wants to protect us. He zealously and jealously guards us and watches over us. Now that helps us to make sense of this. Let's look at the privileged status of the people of God. God chose this people group not because they were special, not because they were super good. He rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He brought them through the barrenness of the Sinai desert. He set them up in a land which could provide food for them. He gave them directions up life quality. And His goal was that they would have an impact on the people groups round about. They would live the Jesus way in modern language, pointing others to God. Others would come and want to share that enhanced life quality. Now that did happen from time to time. We can see it in the days of Jesus, when the people of God, the Jews, had been scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Many of them lived a high quality of life that did make an impact. And people groups round about were affected. And both Jesus and later Paul reached these people with the good news of what Jesus had done. But they went into rebellion right from the days of Solomon. It happened even before that. There are consequences for actions. They decided they wanted to do it their own way for their own selfish benefit. The nation just fell apart. You can look at the social structure of the nation about this time. It was just collapsing around their ears. Here was a culture that was just falling apart. It was about to implode. The ruling classes had appropriated to themselves and left the majority with almost nothing. They were too weak. They were going to be overrun. They were going to be decimated. They were going to be scattered. And foolish leadership brought it on them. And Ezekiel is showing that a tiny minority would survive. And they came from the exiles, the deportees. And they would hold the key for the future. And the future was that. And indeed some did come back. They re-established the land a generation later. And from that people group, in due time Jesus was born and made an impact on the world by his life quality and all he did through his life, death and resurrection for humanity. Go back to Deuteronomy. You find these verses there. Israel, written as Jeshurun, grew fat and kicked. Filled with food, they became heavy and sleek. They abandoned the God who made them, and they rejected the rock of their Saviour, the one who had rescued them from Egypt. They made him jealous with their foreign gods and angered them with their detestable idols, the evil things that went on. They sacrificed to demons, which are not God, gods they had not known, gods that recently appeared, gods your ancestors did not fear. You deserted the rock, that's God, who fathered you. He brought the nation into being. You forgot the God who gave you birth. There's a prophetic picture from the days of Moses of what actually happened. In modern language, when we push God to the margins of life, when we think we know how to run our lives better than he does, we lose out on much that God has for us. God made us, God knows what's best. When we follow the Maker's instructions, we get the best from life. And when we don't, there are inevitable consequences. And that is what Ezekiel was seeing. Now there are messages for the exiles. In simple terms, God was not going to rescue his people or save the city of Jerusalem. The leadership classes thought he would. It wasn't going to happen. And the land would be ravaged and the city besieged. Nebuchadnezzar flattened it. And the siege would be harsh and brutal with food and water supplies. Major problems. People would die in the city as it was bombarded, or they'd be captured and killed as they fled from the city. Some got away and scattered, but their identity as God's people were lost. But a tiny minority would survive as deportees. And from that group was descended Jesus in due time. The reason for it all happening? They brought it on themselves. The leadership had pursued selfish agendas. Politically, religiously, and legally. They were in it for themselves. And the whole of society had become corrupted. Indeed, life quality had dropped so low it was indistinguishable from other people groups round about. Now the purpose of the existence of the people of God had been lost. They were there to show a life quality that was God's life quality, influencing other people and drawing other people to God. They had forfeited their right to exist. If justice was truly carried out, they had been wiped out forever. But God in His grace allowed a remnant to survive. Now this may be painful to hear, but there are clear messages for us today. Just look at what's happening. The amount that we spend per year on our buildings, it's eye-watering. The amount of effort and energy and money that's expended on what's inside the buildings. Jesus never instructed that. There's an enormous amount of effort to train clergy, no matter what the religious denomination may be. They're trained to run our religious systems. But that happens to be true. Studies have shown that the ethical and moral life quality of the people of God, the church, is now no different from wider societies. That's what we've done. That's idolatry. We've worshipped what we're doing in our churches. And we've worshipped our wealth and our education, including our clergy education. That's the comment of a theologian, looking at what was happening then and now. We've won the international context for wickedness. Look at some of the terrible things that have been perpetrated within some of our churches in the last 100 years or so. And we're going to any lengths to preserve our systems and to criticize the system of the church group down the road. That's what God's doing right now. It's happening in front of our eyes, only we can't see it. He's going to sweep away these religious systems. Buildings and clergy are going first. We've got to admit that, like the people of Judah in the days of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, we've reached the point where we've forfeited the right to exist. We were called by Jesus to live the Jesus quality of life and to make an impact positively, not critically but positively, on wider society. And that's what faces us. And now we're honest and look at the facts. That is all true. Insights from Ezekiel make us stop. We need to stop, change our mindset, rethink things, and get back to the drawing board. That's a harsh and shocking message for us today. But it's what Ezekiel was saying then, and is still saying today. We'll move in the next presentation to see how God intervenes.